Good evening, and thank you for joining us on this wonderful conversation. This is part of our Pass the Mic series, which we started a couple of weeks ago. The idea is to bring in Dalit writers, thinkers, activists, lawyers, authors, and hand them the platform to talk about what it's like to grow up Dalit in India, the challenges that they face in order to sensitize us to the country that we live in. Today, my guest is a wonderful young woman, Yashica Dutt. She's a New York-based writer and journalist who writes about gender, identity, and culture. And she wrote a book called Coming Out as a Dalit about her personal experience about growing up as a Dalit in India and what that was like and how she felt the need to hide it for most of her growing up years and a portion of her adult life. Yashica Dutt has been kind enough to join us for this conversation. We'll be taking as many questions as we can through the course of this conversation to keep the chat window active as well. Yashica, good evening, and I believe it's good morning for you in New York. Thank you for making time for us. It's lovely to have you as join us as part of this conversation.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it, especially the series. I've been on so many panels, and I really appreciate the fact that we have an open platform to really put out our perspectives unfiltered. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. It's my pleasure. And the platform is open to you. I want you to first talk about your book, Coming Out as Dalit, where you talk about the fact that you spent a large part of your life hiding your caste or hiding from your caste and not acknowledging it. Tell us why you felt that way. Tell us your story.
Yeah, I've written a whole book about it. It's something I've been talking about since 2016. So I grew up in a lower caste, quote unquote lower caste, manual scavenging family in a small town in Rajasthan called Ajmer. And while we had education privilege, and the reason I call it education privilege is that because most Dalits in India don't have the privilege of being educated. So we had education privilege for 2 generations. Thanks to my grandfather who belabored and was able to educate himself. My dad was, went to college, and I was able to go to college. But at the same time, it's the story of so many Dalits in the country today. We are told that if we want to survive, if we want to succeed, we have to hide our caste. We have to lie about it. Because when we don't, the consequences of doing that can be dangerous and can be violent. Not just discriminating, but starting from school, you don't know how the teachers are going to behave with you, whether they'll allow you to sit with the other students, whether you'll be allowed to share lunches. Because even within the Dalit community, the degree of untouchability becomes worse as you move down the ladder. So the whole idea was that if you want to have a shot at a normal life, a normal being, a life without discrimination, a life without daily humiliation, a life where you're not made to feel ashamed for who you are, then the only way you can do that is by lying about your caste. And this is a very common practice. Almost so many people that have gotten in touch with me since the book came out have talked about how this is their life. We lead these double identities. We are forced to wear these masks in public. We are constantly afraid that what happens when someone rips that mask off and they find out the shameful secret that we are carrying. So till I was in New Delhi, where I was a journalist for a long time, I constantly hid my caste, and I lived in this terror, in this consistent fear that somebody someday will find out. And what's going to happen to my career? Maybe I won't get the bylines. Maybe, it never happened. So there is no way for me to find out. But how would I be treated in the newsroom? How would my friends treat me? Will people even talk to me? So those were just the daily concerns that I live with. But I just also want to add that this is not something that not everybody does that. So many of our Dalit brothers and sisters in India are out and open with their identity, and I'm so proud of that. But I wasn't like that. Only when I moved to New York, when I had the objectivity to remove myself from this question, this constant inquiry. What is your caste? Everywhere I went in India, whether it was for to get a room, an apartment for rent, or just anybody standing in a line. In fact, I remember when my mom was getting operated, she had a serious operation to get her uterus removed. And I was waiting for the doctor to come out and tell us how things were. And there's a lady next to me, started having a conversation. And the second question she asked was not whether my mom was okay, but what my caste was. And I was so upset and concerned already. I was afraid to the point of anxiety that I yelled at her and I said, I'm Bhangi. What are you going to do? Not marry your son to me? Is that why you want to ask that question? It's just a daily humiliation that we have to go through. And when I moved to New York, I realized that I was not answerable to anybody. Suddenly I was free. Suddenly that weight was lifted. My identity here was a brown woman, but not a Dalit woman. So that allowed me to examine my caste in an objective way and to really question, do I have to feel ashamed? Is a society, if it's telling me that being Bhangi is something so dirty, so vile, so shameful, is that accurate? And while I was doing that, at the same time, as I've written about constantly, I had I had the life-changing experience of reading Rohit Vemula's last letter. And that was something that changed me forever, because I had not read a Dalit person being so out and so proud and really talking about the experiences that caste superiority inflicts on us. And that changed me in a way in which I could never go back. And I questioned about being in Colombia, being in New York, what I was doing with the resources that I had acquired. Rohit was not hiding his caste. He was staying in Hyderabad, fighting for his identity, and I had the privilege to do that. So I decided to launch a Tumblr called Documents of Dalit Discrimination. And I realized that I couldn't ask people to authentically talk about their stories unless I did that too, unless I told them that I was a Bhangi person who was lying about my caste and why I was forced to do that, until I accepted that my history was not of shame, but of pride, until I took pride in the fact that my great grandfather and my grandfather weren't allowed to touch books, yet they were able to get through the civil services. And I launched that Tumblr. I wrote a Facebook note called Why Today I'm Coming Out as Dalit. And eventually I got a book deal and I ended up writing the book. And since 2016, this is what I've been talking about.
That's brilliant. In fact, Ishi asks a question about the book. She said, in the book, Yashica shares how her grandparents tried to pass off as upper caste. Would she share some anecdotes of what that was like for you at home?
Absolutely. So it was a really strange upbringing. It was pretending that everybody treated us equally when we know they didn't. People would walk into our house, they would say, "Nahi, hum aapke ghar ka pani nahi pi sakte." Like my grandfather was kind of a senior officer, and even the people who were orderlies, people who worked for him, said, "Saab, hum aapke ghar ka pani nahi pi sakte. We can't drink the water from your house." Or yeah, my friends who were very young at that time, we were 5 or 6, they were like, "Aap Harijan ho na? Like, are you Harijan?" They would openly ask that. Or we would try and lead this normal life, but constantly there would be reminders कि वो लोग तो मतलब भंगी family से हैं, उनसे ज़्यादा बात मत करो या उनके साथ खेलने मत जाओ, as far as kids are concerned. So those were quite traumatic experiences, and I grew up with listening to how my grandfather was not allowed to ride a horse to his wedding, in his bridal party in Jaipur, which was, I believe, somewhere in the 50s. The Thakurs, the upper castes, Thakurs that we are hearing so much about right now, it was the same caste. They came out with swords. They came out with naked swords, brandishing कि अगर दलित घोड़ी पे चढ़ेगा तो फिर हम उनका गला काट देंगे. So that was just one of the things I grew up listening to, or how my grandmother actually went for manual scavenging jobs when my grandfather was still studying for the civil services, and how humiliating that was, that people would throw the roti and wouldn't even touch us. Like, I didn't grow up with that, but I grew up with this deep sense that that's my history, that's my identity, which was traumatizing in many ways.
We have a question from Pratik who says, isn't the term scheduled caste better or a more constitutional identity than Dalit? What do you prefer?
I think it's an individual choice. I mean, of course, Dalit is a political identity. We've been, especially in the past couple of weeks, we've heard that over and over again, that it is a collective identity. It is something that we share because of the history that we have in this country. But personally, for me, Dalit is not just, scheduled caste is a benign term. You can say scheduled castes and push us under the rug. It's just acquired, like words acquire meanings over years. And scheduled caste has just become one of those neutral terms to sort of erase the difficulties and the experience that we go through daily. Dalit, for me personally, is a term in which I was allowed to reclaim pride. When I said for the first time that I'm Dalit openly, I think for the first time in my life in 2016, I felt shivers go through my spine, because I was not just some reviled, humiliated Bhangi person who was hiding my identity. I was an out and proud Dalit. So for me and a lot of us in the Dalit community, we feel that this term is associated with pride. And that's why, well, of course, it's a constitutional term, but I think as people who have been oppressed, we have every right to choose language and words and phrases that help us beat the stigma of what we've been forced to deal with all our lives.
There's a beautiful message from Nagraj C who says, Yasika's book, helped me come out as a Dalit with my identity and gives me more courage to live proudly. I think that's a wonderful message. But I also want to talk to you about being a journalist and working in newsrooms. I've had conversations in the past about how representation in newsrooms is far from adequate at this point. But I want to understand what your experience was.
Right. So I remember when I was working in, I think I was still in Asian Age at that point, when the survey came out in 2010, how I think Caravan published it, if I'm not mistaken. There are two Dalit journalists in the country who are out and open. And of course, we know in the 90s, an African American journalist came to India, wanted to get a quote on Kanchiram, couldn't find a Dalit journalist, and was forced to wonder where the Dalit journalists are. So my experience has not been, I was not out. I was not talking about being Dalit, and also I could so easily pass off as upper caste. I had spent my entire life until then learning the mannerisms, making sure nothing about me gives away what the secret that I'm hiding, or choosing to work in fashion and lifestyle instead of politics. So I was kind of shielded from the direct brunt of that experience. But I remember in 2006, when I wasn't even a journalist, when the anti-reservation protests were taking place at Ames and other places. And I remember television media was pretty bad even then. Of course, not as bad as it is right now, but even then, they just displayed these images without context. These images where doctors who are clearly Brahmin, who are clearly Kshatriyas, who are clearly upper caste, sweeping the roads and saying symbolically, we are Dalits because we don't get reservation. And that just twists the whole narrative. The media has done nothing to explain what is really going on in this country. In fact, ever since independence, and even before, we've had this whole project, this myth making that caste doesn't exist. And the Indian government, every government since 1947 has worked really hard to make sure that this secret doesn't come out in the rest of the global community, that India still has a horrible time dealing with caste. And media has actively helped institutionalize that myth. That's why so many people in India, even today, don't believe that caste exists. That's why people like me and our other Dalit brothers and sisters, writers, activists, we spend our time convincing you that caste is a reality. Why do we have to do that? Is because the media has uncritically put out stories that only portray us either as the victim or somebody who's corrupt and doesn't deserve reservation. So, even in the Hathras case, for example, the identity of the Dalit victim was talked about as it should be. But where was the identity of the Thakur men? We only learned about their caste location because of Bhima, because of caste activists who went to that location and really talked about what was happening there. So why has the media not been talking about how the upper caste exerts its influence? Why do we just hear stories about Dalit woman raped, full stop? What happened there? Why was she raped? What were the caste intricacies? What was the dynamic between the two families? Were they being hounded for touching a hand pump that was collected to the village? Was this a revenge rape? Where is that context? And that, I think, is one of the biggest failures of Indian media, to be a completely upper caste media in that sense, not going into the story as they should, not doing their job, unfortunately, especially the news media in particular.
Yashica, we also talked about how the media sort of portrays the entire Dalit population, which is a quarter of the country's population, as sort of unidimensional. Tell us why you find that disturbing or worrying.
Well, because there are like 25 million plus of us. Can we be the same person? In the past few weeks alone, you've seen lots of Dalit women talk about the experiences. None of those experiences have been the same, whether it's somebody like me who moved and migrated to the US, or somebody who was born in the United States, or somebody who's an on-ground activist. These are multidimensional experiences. But when you think of Dalits in the public imagination, you think of Kachra from Lagan, who is a Dalit character. And I've talked about this in my books. The readers might be familiar, but like it was so infuriating. It was 2001. I was in 10th standard, and it affected me so deeply that the only so-called Dalit character is called Kachra. That is his identity. He is garbage, and the only way other people will marginally accept him if that person is superhuman in their ability to throw that spin ball. And that's the dynamic, that's the narrative that has been created. Or Dukhi, Om Puri wonderfully portrayed this character called Dukhi, but that's what their life was. And of course, oppression is part of our lives, but we also like to eat, we also like to dance, we also have vibrant cultures, we are different. Where is that narrative? We have like different kind of heroes. One is Singhania, one is Malhotra, one is this and one is that. Where are the different portrayals of Dalit people? And that's why that works to create, what that does is that when you hear about a Dalit woman killed, she's not a person to you. She's just a character. She's just words on newsprint that will tomorrow be used to sell pakoras. So that's the failure of lack of portrayal of multidimensional narratives of Dalit people. They don't see us as human. And that's why when, Kiruba wonderfully put that even when we assert our rights as human beings, that's a problem, because they don't look at us as human. And the media and the bureaucracy and the judiciary and the police force have been hand in glove in this project for decades.
Well, talking about reservation, you did say, of course, that your family benefited from reservation. I want to just get into that for a second, because I want to illustrate to the audience how that can change the lives of an entire family for many generations. Would you please talk about that?
Surely. I mean, just before I get into my family dynamic, I like to quickly point out what happened last week. People who follow me on Twitter might have already heard. Justice Kaju went online to talk about, to basically air his bigoted casteist views, talking about how reservation is a crutch, how reservation is we are undeserving of reservation, how we need to pull ourselves from the bootstraps if we want to go ahead in life. And then he was given this platform on the BBC, which was a panel that me, Tenmori Soundarajan, Beena Palikal, and Roja Singh, who are Dalit activists, were a part of. And my instant reaction was to not give him a rebuttal. My instant reaction was to question the BBC about why we are giving these casteist voices a platform, even in 2020. So I just want to say that this myth around reservation that exists in our global imagination was created around 1990 in Mandal, around the Mandal anti-Mandal Commission anti-Mandal Commission protests, and then cemented in 2006. So just to, talk about how reservation affected my family, I've talked about this. My great-grandfather was not allowed to touch a book. He was not allowed to touch a slate. वो स्लेट भी उनको ये था कि आप अगर स्लेट को छुओगे तो स्लेट will become untouchable. So he had to take a stick and he had to learn to draw the alphabet by crawling it in mud outside the class. This is an experience that's not unique to my family. It is an experience that Ambedkar has talked about. It is an experience that you go to many other Dalit families in the country. They will talk about how they're not allowed to touch other students. They're not allowed to touch desks. They're not allowed to touch books. So can you imagine if there was not a law mandating that we are allowed to study in the same schools and colleges? Would people like me, would people like my grandfather even have a space to go to college? Would we even have a space to attend universities? Or would my family still be engaged in manual scavenging because there were no other avenues for us to escape? That's why reservation is important, because generationally, families who have occupations like manual scavenging, occupations like tanning, occupations like picking dead bodies, or any other number of Dalit occupations, they don't have any understanding of any other trade. We're not Vaishyas. We don't know how to do bookkeeping. We are not Brahmins, right? These are institutional, cultural, this is cultural knowledge that is passed down generations. So without access to reservation, there is no way we can even compete with the rest of the students. Can you imagine Pandit Nehru's dad was a lawyer in London in the 1930s. My grandfather was the first person who hasn't even gotten an education yet. That's the disparity that exists. Ambedkar is just one example. Most people in India who are Dalits right now are still in 2020. They have first generation college goers. That means that nobody in their family has even attended college. And without reservation, there would be no hope of doing that. And let's talk about what happens with reservation. Despite reservation, there have been studies and surveys that have been done. The most prominent one that came out in 2008, Professor Sukhdev Thorat said that 76% students in AIMS said that they were asked about their caste before an exam. Why do you think that's happening? So that the teachers can rank them with lower marks. And those are consequences post-reservation. Can you imagine a world which is not created for us, which wants to keep us out, which has an interest in keeping Dalits subservient? Would they allow us to enter these schools and colleges without a legal mandate? It's impossible for me to think of a world like that exists. When with reservations, there is so much pushback. There are so many seats that are empty because they just can't find the right candidates. And then Justice Kaju goes on BBC and says there are not enough seats for everybody to fill. So this is the dichotomy that we kind of see in India today. And we still have to over and over explain what's going on, why this narrative exists.
There is a question from Pradhinesh Vaidya who says, I wanted to ask you how is corporate India affected by the caste system? Is our merit-based system really foolproof? As we've heard, a lot of friends say their relatives help them get a job in which caste plays a huge role.
Let's just unpack, what does merit mean? Merit means family connections, period. Merit does not mean anything more than that. Merit means that you have the money to go to a coaching institute when you are in 9th standard and study for IITs. That's what merit means. Merit means that you had 3 generations of IIT scholars in your family who told you how to even apply. That's the deconstruction of merit. Merit is not just some inherent talent that you were born up with. Nobody is born with just, of course, some people are, but just like that kind of aptitude for science and tech that you overwhelmingly see in upper caste people, but not in Dalit people, that is constructed. It's not just something that was bestowed or created that way. So of course, our corporate system is severely lacking. Like in 2006-07, even now, many corporates will say, well, reservation is going to ruin our image across the world, which, somebody should go and answer them. You are a multinational corporation. Have you even looked at policies in the US? Have you looked at policies in the UK, which which emphasize on diversity and inclusion. And it's been proven by many surveys that when you have more diverse workforce, you have more productivity. Even in this capitalist system, if you have different kinds of knowledge production, somebody who's a farmer's kid who, grew up, or somebody who grew up tanning leather brings their special knowledge and resources to your company, that will allow it to flourish. So of course, corporate India especially is sorely lacking behind because it's run by upper caste men who think anyone besides them is not fit to have a job or to run a company.
I also want to ask you about marriage. Dr. Ambedkar had written about the fact that the caste system back then was protected by the lack of intermingling, that people were not allowed to marry across castes. And even today, we have quite brazenly all matrimonial ads specifically list out the caste, without any sort of, there's no hiding it. There's no shame in saying that we want a Brahmin girl such caste. Ishi has also said that you wrote a piece about Netflix's Indian matchmaking and the fact that it was so caste based. Varun Selvan also asked at this point, he says, my parents say that inter-caste or inter-religious marriages do not work because people from different castes will have different culture and behavior, and it will cause friction. What are your thoughts? So I want to understand your thoughts on the whole marriage and, marriage across caste lines ideas.
Yeah, to that question that said intermarriage won't work because they have different culture. Yeah, the culture of oppressing Dalits. That's why intercaste marriages won't work, because you are taught that if you have a Dalit bride or a Dalit groom in your family, that they are lower than you, and that's your culture, and you need to protect it. You need to preserve that. That's why your marriage to a Dalit person is not going to work, because you will not have the fortitude to challenge your family about their casteist ways. And that's why intercaste marriages often fail, because they end with, and of course, this is a blanket statement. I am not married. I have no intention to be. So I don't want to speak for a lot of people, especially in matters of love. But what I do want to say is, many times when Dalit folks marry so-called upper caste folks, a lot of trauma that comes from the family is directed at the Dalit person, whether it's from the relatives, whether it's from the mother or the father, whether it's in just like general untouchability. So, it's all fair to say that intercaste marriages are the answer, but I think without examining our own family's attitudes and even that person's own attitudes, because caste is, like I mentioned earlier, such an invisibilized project. How are our own biases and attitudes about caste, and are we sort of challenging them, and when we are looking to marry a Dalit person? And of course, the whole marriage market is incredibly casteist. It was designed that way because endogamy is the foot soldier of caste and patriarchy. Only with endogamy, which means marrying within your own caste, can you preserve that kind of caste superiority. Brahmin marries a Brahmin, they keep making Brahmin children. A Rajput marries a Rajput, that's what happens. And now I've heard very often people say, oh, mine was an intercaste marriage because I'm a Kshatriya and I married a Brahmin. Well, the caste superiority is the same. That's not really challenging any kind of caste boundaries. It's a good woke thing to say, but it's not really challenging anything. So beyond intercaste marriage, I would say is what people need to do is check in their own biases. And then if you're falling in love with a Dalit person, don't subject them to the trauma of answering to your family and having to deal with their casteist biases.
Do you believe that right now, even, and I want to refer to your article about, or your column about Indian matchmaking, where it's almost so common that nobody even notices it anymore?
I think people notice it. I think it's very deliberate. There is, that's why parents want this absolute control on their children? Why have we seen this backlash from parents in particular about, oh, the children are too modern now, they do what they want to do, we give them a lot of freedom? That all is this fear that our caste privilege is going to be diluted. We won't have anybody to lord over. If these people marry each other or marry Dalits, then how do you know who Dalit is and who Brahmin is when when the offspring is being produced? So I think the marriage market in India, like I mentioned, is incredibly casteist, but even the acceptance of caste within that whole sphere is a deliberate attempt to preserve caste. It's, of course, we can say, yeah, I didn't even see when I was marrying this person, I didn't know what their caste was, but that's inherently a privileged statement to make. Only somebody who's upper caste more or less can say when they're getting married that I didn't even bother to check, because they know that they're not going into a family that doesn't consider them as human.
So, would you say that even on political lines or on cultural lines, someone who says I'm caste agnostic is basically privileged enough to not care about it?
Um, that's not always necessarily the case. A lot of Dalits are told to hide their identities. A lot of Dalits, their parents don't even tell them what their caste is. So I think it's an unfair statement if I would say everybody who's caste agnostic is caste privileged, but there is an inherent privilege in being able to hide your caste, like I did. If I was born in a rural area in even in Grameen Rajasthan, which is like 50 kilometers away from Ajmer, would I be able to hide my caste? Absolutely not. The villagers would remind me every second of my existence what my caste was, where my position was. So when we say caste agnostic, that's a misnomer. That's another way to hide that caste identity. Like, for example, on racial lines, can we hide we are white? No, I mean, if somebody is white, can they hide that? Of course they can pass, they can put on makeup, but that's just very hard to even invisibilize. Caste, on the other hand, is super easy. So instead of saying caste agnostic, maybe acknowledge that I am Brahmin, but I'm actively fighting to annihilate caste, or I'm anti-caste. Those are better terms to use instead of saying, oh, I don't see caste. It's the same argument. I don't see color. I don't see poverty. I don't see inequality. That doesn't fly in 2020 anymore. The discourse has moved past that, thankfully, at least globally.
I do want to ask you this, Yashica. There are a certain number of seats within Parliament that are set aside for scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, and this has been the case, since independence. Do you feel that the people who occupy these seats are doing enough?
Well, if they were, then we would be hearing from them right now. The Dalit leaders, and I don't want to get into commenting about who's doing how much, but I do want to point out that they work from within. Many of them have also worked from within the system. They've also, and also it's not just, I think we need to understand that a Dalit person doesn't exist in a vacuum unless, like me, they move to New York. They are still surrounded by the society that they live in. We've heard of so many female panchayat heads or sarpanches who are Dalit, who are made to sit on the floor. How much power do you think they are able to institutionalize to make any kind of change? So I think when we look at Dalit leaders, we have to look at how they're not just objectively alone, and they cannot change one system. And of course, there have been failures, and we can talk about how Dalit leaders don't do enough. But when there have been Dalit governments in certain states, in UP, for example, the indices have shown that even in the police, there is a better system at taking FIRs. There is a better system at, kind of having a task force that at least listens to what people are complaining about. So it's not perfect by any means, but why should the onus of being anti-caste only be on Dalit leaders? I mean, are we just kind of exporting this responsibility? Is everyone else, the 2 Dalit seats that we have, are they supposed to change the whole system while the 98% of upper caste people or upper caste ministers are just supposed to wash off the responsibility? I would kind of turn around the question and ask, why is it that just Dalit leaders are supposed to work for Dalits and upper caste leaders supposed to work for upper caste? Aren't we a secular country, at least for now? So that's how we should operate.
Well, I have a couple of anonymous questions. I don't normally read out anonymous questions, but they seem valid. It says, Yashica, I would love to hear your thoughts or criticism on Savarna feminists and their appropriation and how this differs from what the men do. And second anonymous question, I don't know if it's the same person, has said, Ambedkar spoke about caste and gender being interlinked. What do you think came first, the casteism or the patriarchy?
Wow, I think they are great questions both. They're interlinked. Caste cannot exist without patriarchy, and at least in India, patriarchy would not exist without caste. So, as far as Savarna feminist movement and appropriation goes, look what we've seen in these past few weeks. We've seen panels where female upper caste female activists have gone and said, well, it is a women's right issue. Of course, it's a women's rights issue, but let's talk about what kind of women. A Brahmin woman is not subjected to the same kind of caste oppression that Dalit women are. And in that sense, this is an absolute failure of the Savarna feminist movement as well. When Bhavi Devi, who is a lower caste woman, not exactly Dalit, but was raped because of her caste origins, because she talked about what happened as a Sathin, her work as a Sathin, and she tried to block child marriages. She was raped as a revenge. But when the Vishaka guidelines came, caste was nowhere mentioned. Why was that omission? Why did that omission take place in the 90s when the activists were on? Of course, they did a wonderful job in bringing that to the forefront. And a lot of what we have in terms of data, we do owe it to all kinds of feminist activists. But it's been a huge oversight that caste has been completely ignored. And could you remind me what the second question was? What were they talking about?
Interlinked. The
Of course
patriarchy.
they're interlinked. Yeah, because like even within sort of the Dalit fold, we have clearly seen that Dalit women are at the absolute bottom. Like in my own family, my mother, being a woman, was subject to so much torment and trauma because she wanted to assert her right to educate her children the way she wanted to. My father wasn't. So they are the same caste location, but they have different gender. And that, I mean, we cannot ignore that patriarchy exists pretty much everywhere. It seeps in all our relationships, all our dynamics across the entire country.
So when you say your mother was subjected to more trauma, are you comfortable telling us what happened?
Sure. This is a part of the book, so absolutely. When we were younger, growing up in Rajasthan, having too many girl children is a curse. It's not an inconvenience, it's a straight up curse, or at least it was when I was young. So my mother wanted to send us to good schools because she understood that only through education could we be liberated. But my father's family actively opposed this idea and said, why do you want to waste your money on educating girl children? They are going to go to a separate house anyway. And this was a progressive Dalit family. And I know this is not the kosher thing to do. This is not the right thing to do, to talk about, to talk about Dalit men and patriarchy on a public platform. But, this is my life. And this is what I saw my mother go through. And this is what I see a lot of Dalit women go through when, for example, there's this practice that I've talked about where if Dalit worker works on a certain land and he marries a Dalit woman, the right to consummate the marriage is of the landlord. The upper caste Thakur landlord first consummates that marriage, and he keeps his slippers outside the house whenever he wants to rape her, essentially. And the slippers outside are an indication that the landlord of the house is raping his wife. And even in that narrative, the trauma is the trauma that we talk about is the hurt pride of the Dalit man, and how he's infantilized, and he's not even able to claim his woman. But what about the Dalit woman who's treated like this object? Where is our perspective on her? So even between Dalit men and Dalit women, there is an absolute consideration of gender that needs to be looked at, because I think, like I said, we are post debating whether gender imbalance exists in India in particular. We should be, fear not. So I'm just going to assume we are. But even within that, that gender imbalance plays an absolute role in how our caste relations play out. Because Dalit people don't live in vacuum. They live in the same society that we all grew up in.
Jyotsna Katiyar asks this question. She says, do you believe this new generation will changes anything, or is it a hoax and a privileged layer that everyone is hiding behind?
I don't think it's a hoax. That's a terribly dystopian point of view. And I understand why some people want to have that. And I see, because there is a kind of cynicism. We have seen that. We thought around Mandal in 1990, when there was this whole movement where people were sensitized to reservation and the plight of Dalits, then maybe a change will happen. That didn't. We thought in 2006 a change will happen, and that didn't come. But this generation, especially when I say this generation, I don't mean millennials like myself. I mean Gen Z, who are way more politically aware and connected and are influenced by their global counterparts. And globally, what we see in the United States is Gen Z is more liberal, more democratically inclined, more socialists, at least in the United States. So when the Gen Z in India is interacting with and see their counterparts fighting for these ideas of freedom, a lot of Gen Z kids were involved in BLM, Black Lives Matter protests in the United States and across the world. So we see a lot of Indian kids also being inspired by that. And that is a positive change that I think should be acknowledged. We don't have to be cynical and say, oh, this is all your privileged outlook, because nobody is born with, oh, I know everything. When we do that, we exclude people. We say, oh, you don't even know this fact, you're an idiot. That is not the way to go about things, because while there've been this amazing literature that exists in the US on how to be anti-racist, similarly about anti-caste, this is an everyday thing. It's a journey that we all undertake. We do it every day. So it's not something that we should write off people with saying, oh, you have privilege, therefore you have no right to speak. I only personally believe that people should be investigating their own lives and then maybe act out as allies and support. So it's not just all privilege and hoax and smoke and a smoke show. I feel it's a little deeper than that.
My last question to you is about being an author and why we see so few Dalit writers. First of all, we don't read any of the writing in school or in college, and there are so few writers at all. And what that has been like for you as a writer?
I think if I can say so myself, charted my own course. I did not go the way every author is supposed to go. I moved to the US, had no intention of being an author, wrote this Facebook note that went viral. That was the power of, first of all, our Dalit internet that kind of broadcast that, Dalit Twitter, Dalit Facebook, where it became popular. And it became so big that, mainstream news companies had to pay attention, like whether it was NDTV, whether it was Scroll, whether it was HuffPost, everybody talked about that note. And then they also, I had to be kind of better than what is expected of me to be able to get that book deal. There is this pressure on being perfect every single time. I had to come to Colombia. I had to work in Hindustan Times for a super long time. I had to make a life in New York. Only then was I considered worthy of a book deal that authors in India who are upper caste get on their own. Like, for example, Chetan Bhagat has many book deals, and he didn't have to. Of course, he's IIT, IIM, etc. And I'm just talking about the content. They didn't have to go through that struggle that Dalit people have to go through to prove that we are worthy to catch that kind of attention. So my experience has just been coming from this understanding that nothing will be easy, nothing will be handed to me. I have to fight for it. I have to detonate the entire system. I have to find ways to curve around, to go around, to just, whether it's by lying, by passing as an upper caste person, by hiding my identity. I have to do whatever it takes to be, if I want to succeed, because there is no other way. The usual pathways that are available for upper caste people don't exist for me. And that's one of the reasons we don't hear Dalit authors, because, let's face it, Ambedkar wrote so many books. We don't read any of them. And there is a reason, because this is a project. We don't want to talk about Dalit voices. And now, the only reason we are doing that now is because of social media, is because of internet, because it's become too big to ignore. We are a problem that's too big to ignore. So that's why we now have a mic.
What is your message to the people who are watching right now, who obviously want to be part of some change?
I would say that, this is something Suraj has also talked about, and I fully agree with him. Don't just be online all the time. Go read some books. Go read some Ambedkar. Don't get all your information from memes. And I think it's important for us to acquaint ourselves with anti-caste literature. There is incredible amount of information that's available offline and online. Engage in that and really deeply question about the narrative that you've been made to believe. Don't take everything for face value. Just because you feel that casteism doesn't exist, maybe that's not the right way to think about things. And listen to, like everybody's been saying, amplify Dalit voices, listen to Dalit women, listen to Dalit folks, of course, but also understand their experiences. Don't just wash your hands off your duty and say, well, I give you a shout out on my Instagram and that's it. Really engage with this discourse and challenge when somebody, the person who comes to pick up your garbage, how do you treat them? When the person, when you have somebody who's your domestic help comes into your house, when somebody comes to clean the bathroom, how do you treat them? Really, that's where the change should begin. Not just, of course, social media is so great when it comes to amplifying issues, but really think about your own life first.
Well, I have to leave it there because we've run out of time, but I'm so glad we were able to have this conversation, and I do hope we can have more conversations in the future. For our audience who've joined us, please share this video with as many people as you can. Remember, Pass the Mic is a platform we're creating where we just give the space to people from the community to use this space to tell their stories, to sensitize as many people as we can. Thank you for watching. Good night.
Thank you so much for having me, Faye. Really appreciate this opportunity and the platform.
Thank you.